The wind had been howling since midnight, dragging cold across the plains and rattling the loose boards of the ranch house like a warning. The lonely rancher had been awake long before dawn, sitting at the small wooden table with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. Sleep rarely came anymore, not since the house learned how quiet it could be after loss. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to sound like footsteps, each second reminding him that morning would arrive whether he was ready or not. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud. It wasn't firm. It was the kind of knock that almost apologized for existing. At first, he thought the wind had finally broken something loose, or maybe a branch had struck the door. He stood slowly, every instinct telling him no one good arrived at a ranch before sunrise. The second knock came weaker than the first, followed by a soft sound, someone sliding down the door. The rancher opened it with one hand on the frame, ready for trouble. Instead, he found a woman. She lay half collapsed on his porch, her coat torn, her face swollen and darkened with bruises that hadn't yet faded into yellow. One eye was nearly closed. Her lips were cracked, bleeding slightly from the cold. In her shaking hand was a folded paper, damp and wrinkled, with his name written on it like a last prayer. I was told you were kind," she whispered before the strength left her voice. The rancher knelt without thinking. He had seen injured cattle, broken men, even death, but this was different. This was human pain, raw and close. He noticed the way she flinched when he reached out, even gently, and it stirred something sharp in his chest. He spoke softly, slower than usual, as if loud words might break her. "You're safe," he said, though he wasn't yet sure it was true. He carried her inside, the door closing behind them like a line drawn between the world and what remained of his heart. The house smelled of wood smoke and old memories. He laid her near the fire, fetched clean water, and tore strips from a spare shirt to tend to her wounds. She watched him with wary eyes, tracking every movement like a frightened animal unsure whether kindness was real or just another lie. As he cleaned the dried blood from her cheek, she finally spoke again. "I was a mail-order bride," she said, the words heavy with shame. "I came because I had no other way out. They said I'd be a wife. They said I'd be safe." Her voice cracked on the last word. She told him how she had arrived to a man who treated her like property, how beatings replaced promises, how she ran in the night after realizing no one was coming to rescue her. The letter with his address had been passed to her by a woman who whispered, "Try the rancher west of the river. He lost his wife. He won't turn you away." The rancher felt the weight of that sentence settle deep inside him. He looked at the woman by his fire, bruised, terrified, and still brave enough to knock on a stranger's door. Memories of his late wife flooded back, her strength, her softness, the way she once said that turning people away was the only thing that truly haunted a soul. Outside, the sky began to pale, dawn creeping in quietly. He folded the letter and set it on the table. "You won't go back," he said, his voice steady now. "And you won't leave until you're ready." For the first time since she arrived, her shoulders loosened. Tears slid down her face, not loud, not dramatic, but full of relief. The knock before dawn had ended his loneliness. And neither of them knew yet that it had also begun their fight for a future. Morning came slowly, as if the sun itself hesitated to shine on a world that had treated the woman by the fire so cruelly. Pale light filtered through the small ranch window, revealing the full truth of her injuries, bruises blooming dark along her arms, a cut near her temple, and the exhausted hollowness in her eyes. She slept fitfully, waking at every sound, fingers curling into the blanket as though it were the only thing keeping her tethered to safety. The rancher moved quietly, careful not to startle her. He had lived alone long enough to forget how much noise one person could make just by existing. He cooked eggs and warmed bread, setting the plate near her when she woke, then stepping back to give her space. She stared at the food as if unsure it was meant for her. "You can eat," he said gently. "No one's keeping count." That simple sentence broke something inside her. She ate slowly, carefully, flinching when the floor creaked or the wind struck the walls. Every kindness seemed to confuse her, as though cruelty had taught her to expect a price for every good thing. Over the next few days, the ranch became a quiet refuge, but not a fortress. He cleaned and bandaged her wounds each morning, noticing how she braced herself less with every passing day. She began to speak more, though her voice stayed soft, as if loud words had once brought pain. She told him her name, where she came from, and how the promise of marriage had been her last hope to escape a life already closing in on her. "I thought if I was someone's wife, I'd matter," she said one evening, staring into the fire. "Instead, I became something owned." The rancher listened without interruption. He understood ownership too well, of land, of animals, of grief that refused to release its hold. He did not tell her he understood. He only listened, and that was enough. But safety has a sound, and silence can be suspicious. By the third day, word had reached the nearby town. A woman seen riding into a lone ranch. A stranger with bruises. The looks at the supply store sharpened when the rancher went for flour and medicine. A man asked too casually, "Didn't know you'd taken on a wife." The rancher felt the old warning stir in his chest. When he returned home, he found her standing at the window, tension tight in her posture. She had heard riders pass earlier, slow, deliberate. The kind of ride meant for searching. "They'll find me," she said, her voice trembling. "They always do." That night, fear returned like a familiar enemy. She jumped when a coyote howled. When a horse snorted outside, she reached for her boots, ready to run again. The rancher realized then that offering a bed and warmth wasn't enough. The danger hadn't stayed behind with the bruises, it had followed her here. "You don't have to leave," he told her firmly when she suggested it. "Running is what they expect." "But staying puts you in danger," she replied. "I won't be the reason someone else gets hurt." Her words struck him harder than any threat. For years, he had avoided attachment because loss felt safer than caring. Now, caring had arrived anyway, bleeding, afraid, and standing in his kitchen. He stepped outside that night, checking his fences, his rifle, the long road leading to the ranch. The land was open, exposed, honest. There would be no hiding if trouble came. When he returned inside, he made a choice without announcing it. "You're not a problem," he said. "You're a person. And this is still my home." She looked at him then, not with fear, but with something close to belief. Yet as the fire crackled and the night stretched on, both of them understood the truth. The ranch was a shelter, but it wasn't safe yet. And the past was already on its way. The first sign wasn't the riders, it was the birds. The rancher noticed the sudden silence while mending a fence at the edge of his property. The meadow that usually hummed with life had gone still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He straightened slowly, eyes scanning the horizon, hand resting near his belt. Dust rose in the distance. By the time he reached the house, 3 men were riding in, their horses moving with the lazy confidence of people who believe the world owed them obedience. The woman saw them first. Her face drained of color, and she stepped back from the window as if the glass might shatter under their gaze. "That's them," she whispered. "They won't stop." Her hands shook as she reached for her coat, old instincts screaming that escape was the only survival. The rancher caught her gently by the arm, not to restrain her, but to ground her. "Look at me," he said. "You don't belong to them." The words felt fragile in the air, but they were true. The riders stopped just short of the porch. One dismounted, smiling without warmth. "We're here for what's ours," he called out. The woman ran. "That makes her stolen property." The rancher stepped onto the porch, standing between the men and the door. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for his weapon. His calm unsettled them more than anger would have. "She's not property," he said. "And she's not going anywhere." Laughter followed, sharp and mocking. One man spat into the dirt. Another shifted his hand closer to his holster. The air thickened with the threat of violence. From inside, the woman watched, heart pounding, memories flooding back, hands gripping too hard, voices demanding obedience, the helpless certainty that no one would stop them. She had expected the rancher to step aside. She had prepared herself for betrayal. He didn't move. Instead, he named the law. He spoke of witnesses at the station, of bruises that could not be explained away, of contracts that meant nothing when written in lies and blood. He spoke as a man who had already decided the cost was worth paying. "You step onto my land again," he finished, "and you answer for it." For a moment, no one breathed. The men hesitated, not because they were afraid of him alone, but because certainty had left them. Abusers thrived on silence and surrender. They had expected fear. What they found was resistance. One rider leaned forward. "This isn't over." The rancher nodded once. "I know." They left with dust and threats trailing behind them, but their retreat felt temporary, like a storm pulling back before returning stronger. Inside the house, the woman collapsed into a chair, trembling. The danger hadn't ended, it had only changed shape. She wrapped her arms around herself, shame and fear tangling together. "They'll come back," she said. "They always do." The rancher crouched in front of her, meeting her eyes. "Then we'll be ready." Something shifted between them then. Not romance. Not yet. Something deeper, trust born from action rather than words. That night, he showed her the boundaries of the land, the routes to the nearest neighbors, the signals used for help. He taught her where the rifle was kept, not because he wanted her to fight, but because he wanted her to know she had options. "You survived," he told her. "That means you're stronger than they ever were." Later, when the lamps were low and the world quiet again, the rancher sat alone, grief pressing in like an old wound reopened. He had sworn after his wife's death never to invite trouble back into his life. Yet standing up to those men had awakened something he thought was buried forever. Purpose. Outside, the wind carried away the last of the dust. The past had come looking. And for the first time, it hadn't won. After the riders left, the ranch settled into a cautious quiet, one that felt different from loneliness. It was the kind of silence that listened back. The woman slept poorly at first, waking from dreams where hooves thundered too close and doors never stayed locked. Each time, the rancher was already awake, sitting at the table with his coffee, a steady presence in the room. He never asked what she'd seen in her sleep. He only reminded her where she was. "Morning's coming," he would say. "It always does." Days passed without incident, and healing began in ways so small they almost went unnoticed. Her bruises faded from purple to yellow. The cut near her temple closed, leaving only a thin line she touched absent-mindedly when she was nervous. The fear in her eyes loosened its grip, replaced by something cautious and searching. She asked to help with the ranch. At first, the rancher hesitated. He worried work might feel like obligation, too close to the life she'd escaped. But she insisted, saying her hands needed something real to do. So he showed her how to feed the chickens, how to mend a tear in a fence, how to move slowly around horses so they sensed calm instead of fear. The land responded to her. There was something grounding in the routine. Sunrise chores, shared meals, evenings spent watching the sky burn orange and gold. For the first time in a long while, the rancher heard laughter in his home, not loud, not careless, but honest. It surprised them both. They talked more, especially at night when the lamps were low. She told him about her childhood, about learning early that silence was safer than protest. He spoke of his wife, not the sickness that took her, but the way she used to sing while hanging laundry, the way she believed kindness was a form of courage. Speaking her name no longer felt like reopening a wound. It felt like honoring something that still mattered. Yet the world beyond the ranch did not soften. When they went into town together, eyes followed them. Some with curiosity, others with judgment. A woman alone was suspicious. A man sheltering her was questioned. The whispers were not loud, but they were sharp. She felt them like old bruises pressed too hard. One afternoon, after a particularly tense visit, she stopped walking halfway back to the wagon. "I don't want to be hidden," she said quietly. "But I'm tired of being looked at like I don't belong anywhere." The rancher studied her face, seeing strength where fear once lived. "Belonging isn't something other people grant," he said. "It's something you claim." That night, they sat on the porch as the stars came out. She admitted she was afraid to hope, that every good moment felt like something that could be taken away. He understood that fear better than he wanted to admit. Loss had taught him the same lesson. Still, something undeniable was growing between them. Not dependency, but choice. She stayed not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she wanted to. He protected not out of obligation, but because her presence had made his life fuller. When another rider passed the road without stopping, her body tensed, but she didn't run. She breathed. She stayed. The rancher noticed. Healing, he realized, wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the absence of fear, but the courage to live despite it. In shared work, quiet trust, and moments of unguarded peace, two broken lives were learning how to stand upright again. The past still existed, but it no longer ruled them. And that, in itself, felt like freedom. The final threat did not arrive with shouting or raised guns. It came with papers, false claims, and men who believed authority could be bent to serve cruelty. One quiet morning, a stranger wrote in carrying documents meant to drag the woman back into a life she had already survived. The words were clean and official, but the intent beneath them was as brutal as the blow she still remembered. Her hands shook as she read them. "They're saying I'm bound by contract," she whispered. "That I owe them my return." The rancher read the pages slowly, his jaw tightening. He had expected this. Power often tried to reclaim what force could not. He folded the papers carefully and set them aside. "Contracts signed under violence don't hold," he said. "And neither does silence." This time, they did not wait. They rode to town together, side by side, not hiding, not running. The rancher called on witnesses, on the shopkeeper who had seen her bruises, the doctor who had treated her wounds, the woman who had given her the rancher's name in a whisper of hope. One by one, voices rose, quiet at first, then steady. The men who once claimed her shifted under the weight of truth. Lies unravel when forced into the light. When it was over, the woman stepped outside into the afternoon sun, breath leaving her chest like she had been holding it for years. For the first time since she crossed borders chasing safety, the past had no legal hold on her. But freedom raised a harder question. She turned to the rancher that evening as they packed supplies. "I don't know who I am yet," she said. "I just know I don't want to belong to fear anymore." He nodded. "Then we leave." She reached for his hand without thinking and pressed it to her stomach. "The baby," she whispered. "He's moving." Ethan went still. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his throat worked as he swallowed. "Hello there," he said quietly, as if afraid to scare the moment away. Something shifted between them then. Not romance, not yet, but connection. A shared future no longer built solely on sacrifice. When labor came, it was in the middle of a snowstorm. The road to town was nearly impassable, but Ethan rode through it anyway, returning with the midwife just in time. Clara screamed and cried and prayed, clutching Ethan's hand as the pain tore through her. And then, life. The baby's cry cut through the storm like a promise. "It's a boy," the midwife said with a smile. Ethan's knees nearly gave out. He laughed, a sound Clara had never heard from him before, rough and unguarded. When the child was placed in her arms, Clara wept, not from pain, but from relief so deep it felt like breaking free. "What will you name him?" the midwife asked. Clara looked at Ethan. Really looked at him, the man who had stood up in a church and claimed a child that wasn't his, then lived every day as though the claim were sacred. "James," she said softly. "After my father." Ethan nodded. "James Cole," he added. In the months that followed, the town changed. Slowly. Neighbors stopped by with small gifts. A few offered apologies without words. Respect replaced suspicion. One evening, as spring warmed the land, Ethan found Clara rocking James by the fire. He hesitated, then spoke. "I know this began as a lie," he said. "But if there's room, I'd like it to become something real." Clara met his eyes, seeing not obligation, but hope. "It already has," she replied. And in that quiet moment, they understood, family was not always born of truth spoken at the start, but of love proven over time.